So in this section, we're going to talk about the beginnings of state building in early modern Europe. So basically, when we talk about the rise of France and the rise of England as powers in Europe, we have to look at how they became enabled to do so. How did they create the structure politically and economically to be so successful? And a lot of that has to do with religion and some growing pains when it comes to religion here during the Reformation era. So we're going to look at the early modern Europe for England and France. We're going to look at how religion gives way to state building in these two countries. So let's talk about religious tension in France. France, as you know, is a predominantly Catholic nation. About this time during the Reformation, you're looking at 90% or so of France being Catholic. Calvinism is taking hold, though, with a power struggle in the mid-16th century. French Calvinists were called Huguenots, and what happens is we create a little bit of a power vacuum as we see weak leadership in the royalty at this time in the Valois dynasty. And what happens is the nobles, similar to what they do in the Holy Roman Empire, some of the nobles adopt French Protestantism as a way to be kind of a check on the power of the Valois dynasty. So this allows the Huguenots to grow in population. Some estimates, I think McKay mentions that they could be as much as 20% of the population at this time in France, but probably closer to 10%, 10 to 20%. Regardless, this creates a significant Protestant population, and as we know, Calvinism is one of the more extreme and strict versions of Protestantism during the Reformation, and it has a very low tolerance for Catholicism and all of the practices that come with the Catholic Church. So this creates bad blood between Catholics and Huguenots, and violent clashes break out between Catholics and anti-monarchial Protestants who believe that, similar to what Calvin writes in Institutions, that there should not be necessarily an absolute Catholic monarch, certainly not Catholic, but more so that there should be a strict, rigid, Calvinist institution of religion and state. So this is going to create a problem. The Huguenots are going to destroy churches and create some destruction. Catholics will use violence back against the Huguenots, and on and off and on and off we see clashes that are very violent and very bloody between French Huguenots and French Catholics. The most famous of this would be the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which takes place in August 24th, 1572. And what happens is Margaret of Valois marries Henry of Navarre, and Margaret of Valois is Catholic, obviously. Henry of Navarre, though, is a Protestant. He's not a strict Huguenot-type Protestant, but he is Protestant nonetheless. And at the wedding, you see the Catholic guests and the Protestant guests, as you can imagine, don't get along, and violence breaks out between the wedding guests in Paris. And the violence not only is confined to this wedding or even Paris, but breaks out and spreads out throughout the entire nation. This spins off violence across all of France with devastating consequences. Thousands of French Huguenots being slaughtered in the streets of Paris and beyond over this marriage. It just shows you how volatile the religious situation was in France. And as you can imagine, if a country has this kind of religious instability, you can't possibly expect that country to be a powerful force in Europe with all the internal strife. So eventually, Henry III, Catholic Valois Henry III, becomes King of France. And Henry III is criticized because he makes the first real attempt here at religious tolerance and bridging the divide between Protestants and Catholics in France. And he is actually assassinated by a Dominican friar who's so upset with this tolerance of French Protestantism. So Henry III is assassinated, and on his deathbed, he is shown in this picture as anointing Henry IV as the next king. Now, he was supposed to succeed Henry III regardless, but this picture reinforces the idea that Henry IV was given the blessing of Henry III. So we have a problem, though, because Henry of Navarre, Henry IV, is a Protestant who is about to ascend to the throne of a very Catholic France. Judging by how the St. Bartholomew Day Massacre went, this is probably not going to go over well. So let's talk a little bit about Henry IV. He ascends to the throne, like I said, when Henry III is assassinated. He converts to Catholicism to smooth over tensions. His famous line here is that Paris is worth a mass. It's worth a mass. It is worth converting to Catholicism, attending Catholic masses, and being a Catholic if it means that he gets to be king of France. Um, if you're a Protestant, you're outraged. You feel like you've been sold out here by Henry IV. And if you're a Catholic, even if you're the Pope at the time, you're incredibly critical of Henry's move. You know, how can you trust a guy who just suddenly converts to Catholicism for the sake of being king? Henry IV is an example of what we call politiques, who are these leaders in early modern Europe who put their state before religion. The idea that religion is important, but it's not everything. And considering what we've seen in the Reformation chapter here, this is a pretty big deal. This is a very different shift in priorities compared to the rulers that we studied so far in this course. And once Henry IV becomes king, he will issue something called the Edict of Nantes, which is an imperial edict, and it allows Huguenots to practice their religion freely. This is a big deal. This is basically saying that Protestants and Catholics, he's forcing them, they will get along, and they really have no say over it in particular. Now, how is he able to do this? You'll see that in the reading, in the Baumgartner reading that you're going to do tonight. You will see that Henry has a structure. For example, he has some Catholic nobles who support him and are also politiques and subscribe to the idea that a peaceful, stable France is better for everybody, regardless of religion. And Henry himself is a pretty forceful king, and he will make the right political moves and the right political decisions to eventually dismantle the Catholic League in France. And the other thing, too, is that a lot of the people of France at this point, as we turn into the 17th century, are so sick of fighting over religion that they're a little bit more accepting of this kind of a maneuver than they would be, say, 50 years before, 40 years before. So that is how we start to see a pivot here in France towards the state over the religion, at least when it comes to day-to-day affairs. So this paves the way again for a strong French monarchy. And Henry, by the way, is the first of a long line of Bourbon rulers that will go all the way into the French Revolution and beyond. The other politique that we need to talk about here is Elizabeth I of England. So with Elizabeth, she was the second child of Henry VIII. She is a Protestant, and she is imprisoned when her sister, Mary Tudor, first child of Henry VIII, is queen, and she is a Catholic. She's married to Philip II, and Mary Tudor has her imprisoned because she is a Protestant. Mary Tudor got the nickname Bloody Mary, that's where that comes from, because of the brutal repression she had of Protestants. She passed laws that, through Parliament, pushed them through Parliament, that really cracked down on Protestants. It was basically illegal to be a Protestant in England under Mary Tudor. Fortunately for Protestants and for Elizabeth, Mary Tudor dies, and when she dies, Elizabeth I ascends to the throne. And there's a whole host of social and political implications that go with this, but the focus here is on the religious aspect. This creates panic amongst Catholics. Catholics are terrified that Elizabeth is basically going to exact revenge for Mary Tudor's actions on behalf of Protestants. And she is a Protestant herself, and she was imprisoned by Mary and almost executed by Mary. Elizabeth has an opportunity to do that if she wishes. Why not? She's the queen now. Instead, what happens is Elizabeth consolidates her power through the church, and she takes a series of actions here that will make her a much more powerful monarch using the Anglican Church. One of those is the Act of Supremacy, which makes her the supreme governess of the Church of England. This is an important distinction here, that she's the governess and not necessarily head of church, because that keeps at bay those who were strictly against the idea of a woman being quote-unquote head of church, although there's not really much of a difference. But semantics is everything here. Also, another thing that's important is the Act of Uniformity. And what this does is it forces everybody to go to services in the Anglican Church. Everybody is a member of the Church of England, and everybody, including Catholics, is forced by law in the Act of Uniformity to attend service every Sunday in an Anglican church. This only passes by 3 votes in Parliament. It's very controversial. But Elizabeth does this so that there's some uniformity, just like the Act says, so that everybody's on the same page. And since they're going to the church that she is the governess of, it doesn't hurt either that they are following the homilies and the addresses from the ministers that will support her beliefs and her causes. Another important thing with the Act of Uniformity is everybody uses the same common book of prayer. And this updated version of the Common Book of Prayer incorporates a lot of Catholic type themes in it as well. It's literally a compromise between Protestant hymns, Protestant prayers, and Catholic prayers and hymns. So what happens is Elizabeth here, although she's forcing everybody into the Anglican Church, and there'll be problems with that for sure, takes a moderate route to appeal to the Catholics of England. Because again, she is a politique. She is of that same philosophy of Henry IV, where state building and nation building is more important than religion at the end of the day, at least when it comes to being a monarch. So just real quick, some the Anglican Church under Elizabeth. Things that are very much Protestant. Services are in English, they are not in Latin, so we're reinforcing something that her father, Henry VIII, created. Also something that Henry VIII established is that monasteries are still abolished. There are no monasteries in the Church of England, and she will not reestablish them. And the clergy is allowed to marry under the Anglican Church, something that is not allowed of Catholic priests. However, there are some Catholic elements in this Anglican Church, because the idea here is unification of Protestants and Catholics. For example, services are still elaborate. There's lots of ornament inside the churches, which is upsetting to Calvinists and Presbyterians in Scotland and in England. The hierarchy of the church is intact. Remember, it's that hierarchy that made Henry VIII a powerful king, and that hierarchy is still intact. The hierarchy of the church is very much political, just like it is in the Catholic Church at this time, and supportive of Elizabeth. And like I said, there are Catholic elements in the Mass. There are sacraments and there are rituals and prayers that very much resemble a Catholic Mass. And the idea here, again, is to be some sort of compromise between Catholics and Protestants. And for the most part, although Elizabeth has her enemies, she is a wildly popular queen by the end of her reign, and no doubt because of, in part, the moderate stance, but firm stance she takes in bringing everybody under the Anglican Church in England. So just to kind of recap here, how does this all relate to state buildings? We've talked mostly about religious wars and religious strife. Before this new pivot here with leaders, religion over the nation, and I use that term very loosely because, again, we still see ourselves here in these countries as under a certain king or queen and not necessarily French or English. That'll come later. English, maybe. But anyway, religious authority is political authority in the old way here, all the way through this time. But as these politiques develop across Europe, what we have is this belief that strong nation is not incongruent with religious beliefs. Rather, they can serve each other. And the politiques, this idea of being a politique, challenges the sole authority of religious institutions in Europe. It is obviously difficult to achieve this tolerance. We saw many failed attempts in France. Henry III is assassinated by a Catholic priest over this. But if you can pull it off, it creates the political and economic stability necessary to build strong European empires in the 17th century. And as we will see in this absolutism chapter, France and England are two of the strongest countries, two of the strongest powers in Europe in the 17th century, because they have created this infrastructure and this strong central authority that is beyond the religious wars that we saw during the Reformation. And that sets the stage for absolutism. So those are your notes on how England and France get through their religious problems and unify and start to turn into absolutist countries. And in the next section, we will talk about absolutism itself.